Welcome to the second part of this Flexbox mini-series. In the last video, we had a look at the Flex container, and we saw that we can add different properties, and by that, change the way the elements nested inside of that container, the so-called Flex items, behave. And the problem is that with adding properties to the Flex container, we can only change the way all items behave. But if you want to change the behavior of a single Flex item, well, then you can also do that. Let's find out how this works, so how we can work with the Flex items in this video. Back in our code, and as always, a link to the code can be found in the video description. And if we look at our page now, well, it basically looks like that. Well, let's maybe increase the width right here and also delete align content. We don't need that actually, so we can get rid of that. And now we want to focus onto these Flex items. Just to remember, these are the different elements we have right here. So these 6 elements inside our container, our Flex container, which you can see right here. And now back to the code again. And now how do we start? Well, let's start maybe with div1 right here. Because the first attribute we could add to a Flex item, and that's important, we added the properties in the last video just to our Flex container, but now we can add all these properties we will have a look at in this video to all Flex items, and they will only affect, well, this Flex item basically. Now, coming back to the property, the first property we could use is this one. This is called order. Now, what does this mean? Well, let's maybe type 1 and save that. If we now go back, have a look at it, div1 is positioned right here. If we now reload the page, we can see that the item is now placed at the last position. Why is this happening? Well, because we added this order property to this div. This means if I set this to 0 and save it again and reload the page, it would be displayed again in the beginning, because normally all items have an order of 0 or a value for order of 0. Now, if we change it back to 1 and then go down to div3 maybe and also add order right there and change it to 3, right? Or it could also be 2 actually. Let's maybe make 2 like that. So if we change it, so we have now order 1 right here and order 3 in this third item. And now reload the page. Well, you can see what happens. Now div1 is positioned at the end because order 1 is bigger than 0, but order 2 is bigger than order 1, so we have placed it right here. And if I now change div1 to order 3, then you can imagine what happens. This will now be placed to the right of this div right here. That's basically how order works. Really important, we talked about that in the last video. This also is based on the way we have set the FlexFlow, for example. If we change that to row reverse, if you don't know what we're doing right here, just have a look at the first video of this Flexbox mini-series. So row reverse, save that, and go back. Well, then you can see that div1 is now placed here. This looks like it would be the first position, but now it's basically the last position because we have row reverse. Then we have the div with the order value of 2. So this div right here, where is it? Here it is. And then we have all the other divs in the normal order, right? So always keep that in mind. That's why I talked a lot about the FlexDirection in the last video, because it's really important to understand how this works, because otherwise, well, results can be confusing in Flexbox. But let's change it back to row, because I think this makes more sense right here, and lets us show our examples easier. However, let's maybe get rid of that. We don't need order actually in our example, and right here. And let me show you another property you can add. Maybe we use div2 right here, because this property is kind of familiar to the one we had already, but now it's different because it refers to a single element or a single Flex item. And this is called align, but now you can see it already. We had align content, we had align items, but now we have AlignSelf. And as the name kind of indicates, this simply defines how our Flex item is positioned related to the cross-axis. That's really important. We also talked about that a lot in the last video, but AlignSelf refers to the position in relation to the cross-axis. Now, let's have a look. If we now say we want to align this item Flex Start maybe, and do it like this, and go back and reload the page. Then you can see exactly what happens. You remember we had that slide in the last video. This means we have now a flex direction of row set in the flex container. And this means the cross axis starts right here and goes from top to bottom. This means adding flex start to this will simply add this item, well, at the start of the cross axis. If we go back and change it to flex end, like that, and go back, then it would be at the end right here, because again, cross axis starts here in our case, ends here, so we position this item right there. And this is basically what you can do with AlignSelf. It is kind of related or similar to what we saw with align items, but this time only relating to a single item. Now, you might again ask yourself, where can I find all these properties and all these values? What can I apply right here? And the answer again is in the MDN, the Mozilla Developer Network. You can find a link to this page down there in the video description. The important thing is right here, you see all the properties that we have. We talk about a lot of these actually in the series. And if you click onto AlignSelf, then you can see that you have a lot of different values that you can apply. Basically, too much values to cover them all in this video, but we just had a look at flex start and flex end, but feel free to play around with these to make sure that the single items behave the way you want them to behave. However, we saw this now and we know how AlignSelf works, so we can actually get rid of it right here. Because there are 3 more properties that I would like to show you, which can be confusing, but actually they are not that difficult if you had a closer look. So let's take this closer look now. And for that, we'll focus on to the last 2 items right here, so div 5 and div 6. Why are we using these? Well, basically, if we reload the page, basically because they have an equal width, and the properties I want to show you now, well, have something to do with the width. So let's add a property right here. And this property is called flex, which is quite intuitive actually. And flex is, just like FlexFlow for the flex container, a property which combines multiple properties. The standard value is 0, 1, and auto. And this simply, or these individual values, stand for the following properties. I'll again add them as a comment here, just to make it clearer for you. The first value stands for FlexGrow, right here. The second value stands for FlexShrink. Oops, shrink, like that. And the third one stands for FlexBasis, like that. Now, what does that mean? Let's maybe go through it step by step. Makes the most sense, I think. So FlexGrow, this is the first value we can see right here. The standard value is 0, as I said. So if we save that, go back and reload the page, we can see that the elements grow up until the point they reach their maximum width. And so this is the width that we defined, so 200 pixels. Let me maybe quickly go back and let me change justify content to flex start, like that, because then it's easier to see that, because now we have more space. So as you could see, we don't increase the width of these items as soon as they reach the maximum width that we defined. Okay, so that's the basic value. That's right here, flex 0. Let me now change 0 to 1 right here. That's not the standard value. So if we save that and go back, we can see that the item right here increased, although we actually reached the limit of the width of 200, but it still keeps growing. And that's interesting, right? Because by adding a flex grow and a number larger than 0, this simply means that we make sure that this item where we add this property, well, kind of increases its width, although we set a limit. Now what's basically happening right here is that the width of this item will be increased or will be stretched up to the point where the entire free space that we have on our page is occupied by that item. You can see it actually right here, because if I increase it or decrease it, it stays right there. And if I decrease the page, you can even see that it still behaves like that and make sure that the entire page is occupied by this item. So that's what you can do with FlexGrow, basically, this first part. But there is more. And to see this more, we simply copy down this right here, oops, including the semicolon, of course, and add it right there. and now change flex right here for our div 6 to 2. So keep in mind, the other items have flex 0, so they won't stretch. The div 5 has a flex value of 1, and div 6 now has the flex value of 2. Now let's see what happens. If we go back and reload the page, we can see that the space is again occupied entirely by our elements. And if you look at it, you can see that only these two elements are, well, kind of stretching or not stretched. But if you look at it closely, it's hard to see, but the last item increases more because, let's have a look. If we start right here and inspect that, we can see that the first item right here has a width of 202.84. Now, the second item right there has a width of 205.69. Now, that's just some rounding, but basically, we can see that the width of this item increased 2 times the amount this item increased. Now, that's important. This item is not 2 times this first item. That's not true. It's just a case that we have a space, a free space that should be occupied, and we defined that the space should be occupied by these two items. But this space, well, you could imagine like that, the space can now be cut into 3 equal pieces, and 2 of these pieces are added to the last item with the FlexGrow value of 2, and 1 piece is added to this first item with a FlexGrow value of 1. Now, if we go back and change it to 3, so the value for flex right here for div 6, like that, and go back, you can see that this item now is 202.13, and this one here is 206.4. So 3 times the growth that we saw for the first item. And that's a really important concept that you have to keep in mind. Always think about the space you have available, divide it into the parts that you have right here. That's at least how I remember that. And then think about it, how many parts should be added to each single item, depending on the flex value that we have added right here. So that's FlexGrow basically. You can specify how a single or multiple items should grow if you change the size or the width of your website. But we have more, because we also have this second value right here, FlexShrink. Now, as the name indicates, FlexShrink helps us to decrease the size of our items. Let's have a look at that now. And to show you that, we will change our parent right here, our Flex container, from wrap, so in the FlexFlow property, to no wrap, like that. Oops, sorry, to no wrap. Now it's correct, like that. Because if we now have a look right here and reload the page, we can see that, well, we can't see a thing because of the inspect tool. We can now see that our items decrease, and they kind of decrease equally. As you can see right here, we learned that in the last video, they decrease up until the point where the content is basically displayed, and then we have the following behavior. So far, so clear, we saw that. And if we look at the size or the width of these elements, we can see 107.8, 107.8. Okay, let's increase the size again. We can see again the following behavior. As soon as we reach the defined width, we can see that this item right here has 234.38. And this one here has 3 times the value, so 303.15. So the same behavior that we saw before. Now let's go back and let's maybe change that flex right here to 1 because it can be confusing now. But now change the flex growth right here, the flex shrink, we just talked about growth, now it's flex shrink, to 3, like that. If we now go back and reload the page, well, we basically don't see a big difference because both items now keep growing the same value because we just defined it, or the same amount of width, so that's equal. But if I now decrease the website right here, can you see it already? I don't think it's clear enough. Let's add a shrink of 4 maybe even, because then it becomes clearer. Yeah, I think now it becomes evident. If we increase the size again and then decrease that page, can you see it? I think now it's clear. The amount, the 5th element right here, decreases is 5 times higher than the decreasing level we have right here for our div number 6, where we have flex shrink of 1, like all the other elements have. So if we try to get it back to a width of 200, which is way too much right here, as you can see. Still too much. Maybe like that. You can see that now we have here a width of 199.7, so 0.3 smaller than the actual width that we defined. And here we have 4 times the decrease because the flex shrink value was set to 4. So this item decreased by 0.3. Well, 0.3 times 4 is 1.2. And this 1.2 decrease can be seen right here. And that's basically how flex shrink works. It allows us, just like FlexGrow actually, when we increase the size, to specify the shrink level or the amount an item can shrink, specifically for a single item or for all items. So that's another important property that you have to keep in mind when you work with the different flex items. But there is one last property that I would like to show you right now. Let's maybe unselect that. And for that, let's set that back to 1, maybe grow to 0, and also here, and save that. Because we talked about FlexGrow and FlexShrink, but we also have Flex Basis. So the standard setting is Flex Basis Auto. And before we have a look at that and change that, what does Flex Basis actually do, or what does it mean? Well, Flex Basis, and this is really important, simply defines the starting size or the standard size of your element or of your flex items depending on the main axis. And that's really important, depending on the main axis. So Flex Basis is not something like the width or the height. It's actually always the size of your element relating to the main axis. Now let's see what that means. Because generally you can define a width, that's no problem. But if you define a flex basis, this will be kind of the value that is considered. This means in our case, we can see that our flex basis is auto, so we will fall back to the width. But just in case that our main axis is related to the width. Now, this can be really confusing. Therefore, let's just have a look at that now. Because if I now keep it right here on auto, the width, but right here define a flex basis of 100 pixels, for example, like that, then we can go back. And we can see, which is quite as expected, that for this fifth element, if we just increase the size maybe like that for this fifth element, a width of 200 pixels was applied. Why did this happen? Well, we saw that we have the flex basis of auto. We also see right here that our flex flow is row. This means the main axis is equal to the width of our page. We talked about that in detail also in the last video. And because of that, the fallback will refer to the width. That's why it works like that. In the second example, or in the second element, we have a flex width of 100 pixels. Therefore, the width doesn't play a role. So we have a width of 100 pixels right here. So far, so clear. And now you might still say, well, apparently the flex basis is just something like the width. But as you will see now, it's not. Because if we go back right here and change our flex flow from row to column, like that, and save it, and now go back to our website and reload that page. Now it gets more interesting, right? Because if we inspect these two items right here, we can see that the width for both items is still 200 pixels, but the height is totally different. And if I would also have increased the size of that box, I'm sorry for that. Let's increase the size of the flex container right here. Now you can see better. And now back to what we just talked about. You can see that for the fifth element, we have a width of 200 and a height of, well, just the amount of height we need for the content. But for the last item, we have a width of 200 and a height of 100. And if you look back at our code right here, we can see why this happened. Because our code, it can now be read like this. We have a flex flow of column. So the main axis, let's go back, goes from top right here to the bottom. This means for the code, we will have a look at the flex basis, which is auto. So the width doesn't play a role because the width would only be important if the main axis would be from left to right, which is not the case. So if we would have height right here, it would use height. As we don't have height, it just uses the standard value, which in our case simply means just give me enough height to present the content. That's the case for this fifth element. But for the last element, we have a flex basis defined right here. And this flex basis now refers to the main axis. Again, the main axis goes from top to bottom. This means it now specifies a height right here. So we have a height of 100, as written right there. And for the width, well, we can of course use the value that we defined. That's why we have a width of 200. So always keep that in mind. Flex basis always refers to the main axis, and it only refers to flex items. So only in a Flexbox context, you can use flex basis. One last example maybe, if I would add height 100 right, or 50 maybe right here, like that, and save that and go back, then you can see that now a height of 50 was added. Just because what I just said, now we have set flex to auto, and therefore it will look for a value for the main axis. In our case, the main axis goes from top to bottom, therefore the height will be used. Now if we change it back to row finally, right here, and save that, we can see that now we will have a width of 50, a height of 50, and we will have a width of 100 right here, and a height that will just be enough to display the content. Let's see if that's correct. As you can see, we have a width of 200, a height of 50, and we have a width of 100 right here, because we defined that for the flex basis, and we have a height that is just enough for the content. And that's it actually, what I wanted to show you regarding the flex items. As for the flex container, it's really important to practice what we just talked about, because with that, you now have an understanding of the real basic concept behind it. But just by watching the video, I think it's hard to really understand all the details. Therefore, I can only encourage you to play around with this example code, because you don't need more code than that to understand Flexbox. And if you play around with that and think about back what we just saw in this and in the last video, I think then you are really ready to go with Flexbox and use it on your websites. And with that, as always, I can only say thanks a lot for watching, hope to see you in the next videos, and bye.